It is the morning of May 8th, 2002. At the Pentagon, the workday has just begun. General Eric Shinseki, 4 stars, Army Chief of Staff, the highest-ranking soldier in the United States Army, is in a meeting when someone passes him a note. The note is not from the Secretary of Defense. It is not from the Joint Chiefs. It is from a staff officer who has just seen a wire report. The Department of Defense has announced to the press that the XM2001 Crusader program is terminated, effective immediately. The Army's most advanced artillery system, 11 years of development, nearly $2 billion, gone. And the man responsible for the entire United States Army found out the same way a reporter in Ohio did, from a press release. That moment, a 4-star general reading about his own program's death in a wire report, is where this story ends. But to understand why it matters, we have to go back to where it began, and we have to understand what exactly was lost on that Tuesday morning. Because what was lost was not just a weapon system. There are 3 questions at the heart of this story. How does the most capable artillery system ever designed by the United States Army end up canceled by a memo its own generals never saw coming? Why, in the wars that followed, did nobody ever build anything to replace it? And did the people who made that decision know exactly what they were doing when they made it? The answer to all 3 questions points to something that goes far beyond artillery. It points to a fundamental miscalculation about the nature of war itself. And we are still living with the consequences today. The XM2001 was not an upgrade. It was not an iteration on what came before. It was a generational leap. Where the M109 Paladin, the howitzer it was designed to replace, could fire 4 rounds per minute under ideal conditions, the Crusader could fire 10, sustained, and 12 in burst fire. But the number alone doesn't capture what made it different. What made it different was a capability called multiple rounds simultaneous impact, MSI. The Crusader could calculate and fire multiple shells at different trajectories, different angles, different propellant charges, different elevations, timed so that every single round arrived at the target at the exact same moment. Think about what that means. You fire 6 shells from a single gun, 6 different trajectories, and 6 impacts hit the same grid coordinate within the same second. That is not science fiction. That was a documented, tested, repeatable operational capability of a machine that existed in prototype at Fort Sill, Oklahoma. The autoloader was the engineering achievement that made all of this possible. On the Paladin, a trained crew of 4 handles 155mm shells, each one weighing roughly 100 pounds, manually under combat conditions, with the gun hot and the enemy shooting back. The Crusader's autoloader eliminated that entirely. The crew was reduced to 3. They never touched the ammunition. The system selected the round, transferred it from the onboard magazine, loaded it into the breech, and was already indexing the next round before the previous shell had reached its target. The Paladin's manual reload cycle took approximately 30 seconds per round. The Crusader's autoloader cycle took 6. And then there was the precision. The Crusader was designed to fire the Excalibur GPS-guided round, a munition that could reach out 40 kilometers and hit a target the size of a car with a circular error probable of under 10 meters. To put that number in context, the standard unguided 155mm shell of the same era had a probable error of several hundred meters at maximum range. The Crusader was not a louder, faster version of what came before. It was a different instrument entirely. By the late 1990s, this machine was no longer theoretical. United Defense, the contractor, had built working prototypes. Testing was underway at Fort Sill. The Army had committed to a production run of 480 systems, enough to equip every heavy division in the force structure. The Crusader was scheduled to enter service in 2008. It was real, it worked, and the United States Army had bet its entire fire support doctrine on it. To understand why the Army needed the Crusader so badly, you have to go back to the problem that created it, and that problem has a specific geography. It has a name, the Fulda Gap, a natural corridor between East and West Germany, approximately 60 miles wide at its narrowest, running from the East German border straight toward Frankfurt. NATO war planners in the 1970s and 80s ran thousands of simulations of a Soviet conventional assault on Western Europe, and in the overwhelming majority of those simulations, the primary axis of Soviet advance ran directly through the Fulda Gap. At peak Cold War strength, the Soviet Union maintained approximately 53,000 tanks, 70,000 armored vehicles, and 41,000 artillery pieces in active inventory. Against that scale of armored force, NATO's conventional defense doctrine depended critically on one capability above all others. Not air power, which was weather-dependent and could be saturated, not anti-tank missiles, which required exposed crews at close range. Artillery. Specifically, the ability to deliver overwhelming volumes of accurate fire against massed armored formations before they could close with NATO defensive lines. The M109 Paladin was the system doing that job in the 1980s, and by every honest assessment, it was not enough. So in 1987, the Army wrote a requirement for something that would be enough. The program they launched was called Crusader, and the specification was built around a single brutal priority: destroy Soviet armor faster than it can be replaced, at ranges that keep American crews alive. Everything else was secondary. The Cold War ended in 1991, and with it, the strategic justification that had built the Crusader began to erode. Not immediately, these things never happen immediately in defense procurement, but gradually, through the 1990s, the question that nobody had a clean answer to grew louder. If the Soviet armored horde through the Fulda Gap is no longer the primary threat, what exactly is the Crusader for? The Army's answer was consistent. It doesn't matter what the next threat is. Overwhelming, precise, survivable fire support is a fundamental military requirement, regardless of the enemy. You do not know what the next war looks like. You build for capability, not for a specific scenario. That argument was reasonable, and it was about to run directly into a man who disagreed with almost every word of that argument. Donald Rumsfeld became Secretary of Defense for the second time in January 2001. He had served in the same role under Gerald Ford in the 1970s, and he had spent the intervening decades developing a very specific theory about what was wrong with the American military. His diagnosis was simple. The United States military was too heavy, too slow, too expensive to move, too dependent on the assumption that future wars would look like past ones. He called his agenda transformation, and in his framework, a 40-ton artillery system that required dedicated airlift and extensive logistical preparation just to reach a theater of war was a military liability. The C-17 Globemaster III, the Air Force's primary strategic transport, could carry the Crusader, but doing so required full payload dedication, specialized loading equipment, and added hours to any deployment timeline. Rumsfeld wanted forces that could be anywhere in the world within 96 hours, light, lethal, networked. The Crusader, designed in 1987 to stop Soviet tanks in the German countryside, did not fit that vision. And then September 11th happened, and Rumsfeld's transformation agenda, which had been a theoretical debate before that morning, became the operating framework of the entire Department of Defense. Here is where the history takes a turn I was not prepared for when I first started researching this. They knew. Not that the Crusader was going to be canceled, but that canceling it would leave the Army without adequate fire support. that the gap was real, that the successor programs being pointed to as justification for the cancellation were not ready, had not been tested, and in some cases did not yet exist beyond a concept document. The internal Army assessments made this clear, the congressional testimony record made this clear, and the men signing the cancellation order had access to all of it.